What if I told you? There's a place in the heart of Missouri where the woods still whisper the names of the men who vanished more than a century ago. 30 hunters walked into the Ozark forest in 1888, men of steel and gunpowder, born to track, hunt, and survive. They were never seen again. When rescuers finally entered those woods weeks later, they found the campfires still smoldering, rifles neatly stacked, and blood smeared across the bark of trees like someone had been dragged upward into the darkness above. And from that day on, no animal has been caught, no hunter has returned, and the locals swear that at night, you can still hear the sound of 30 men screaming beneath the soil. Some say it was a bear attack. Others whisper about an ancient curse, a ritual gone wrong. But the truth buried in those woods is far, far worse. Because the Ozarks aren't just haunted. They're alive, and they've been waiting for someone to listen. Tonight we're going back to where it all began. To the exact place 30 hunters disappeared, and uncovering what the government buried, what locals denied, and what the forest still remembers. So turn off your lights, lock your doors, and don't look out your window, because after you hear this story, you'll start to see movement in the trees. Perfect. So human horror, brutal, real, twisted, feral, and rooted in the filthy depths of the Ozark wilderness. Then get ready. This story will feel too real to be legend. The year was 1888, and winter had crept early into the Missouri Ozarks. The trees were stripped bare, black veins scratching at a gray sky. Somewhere between the mist and the silence, the woods felt hungry. In the town of Marrow Creek, 30 men had gathered at the tavern. Farmers, trappers, drifters, all armed and restless. They had been drinking since sundown, talking about the strange noises that had echoed through the hollows for weeks. Something had been dragging livestock from barns. Entire herds gone overnight. No blood, no tracks. At first, folks said it was wolves. But wolves didn't stack bones into little towers near creeks. Wolves didn't hang skinned deer carcasses upside down in trees like offerings. So the men decided they'd hunt whatever it was. 30 of them. Guns, dogs, lanterns. And they swore they'd bring back proof, or not come back at all. As the night thickened, the last few townsfolk watched the group disappear up the dirt trail that bled into the forest. And as their lights faded into the dark, someone whispered, "Don't follow the sound of crying. That ain't a person out there." By morning, the town was silent. The hunters hadn't returned. The dogs hadn't returned. The only thing that came back was a single boot, found miles from the trailhead. Inside it, a human foot still laced tight. When Sheriff Calloway sent a search party, they found the hunters' camp, cold, empty, and torn apart. The canvas tents were shredded, the rifles still loaded. The ground was covered in drag marks, but not from animals. The shapes were human. Something had dragged them away on all fours. One of the deputies, a kid barely 19, followed a blood trail into the trees and saw something that made him drop to his knees. Hanging from a branch was a strip of human skin, nailed through both ends like parchment. Carved into it, with something sharp and cruel, were the words, "We were here first." 3 days later, people started hearing the noises again. Not just cries this time. Laughter. Low, broken laughter that sounded like it came from deep inside the ground. No one dared to go back into those woods. But one man did, Reverend Thorne, a preacher who believed evil had taken root there. He carried a cross, a shotgun, and a Bible. He said if those men were taken by the devil's work, then he'd drag them back himself. He didn't return either. Only his Bible did, soaked in something dark and sticky, its pages half torn out. On the last surviving page, one word was written over and over in dried blood. Ferals. The Ozark woods had gone quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Predatory quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. By the second week after the hunters vanished, Marrow Creek was half abandoned. Families packed their wagons and fled west, whispering of a curse, of something ancient that didn't like being disturbed. But not everyone left. A man named Elias Brigg, a local trapper and one of the hunters' brothers, refused to believe they were all dead. "Men don't just vanish," he said, his voice like gravel and whiskey. "Not without something making them vanish." So he went looking. Alone. He carried 2 lanterns, a hatchet, a rifle, and his brother's wedding band on a chain around his neck. And on the 4th night of searching, he found something. It was deep in the pine stretch north of Coldwater Creek, a clearing that smelled wrong. Rotten sweet. Metallic. The snow hadn't melted anywhere else that year, except there. At the center of that clearing was a hole. A perfect, round root cellar, half buried and covered in moss. The wood door had carvings on it, human figures kneeling, mouths open like they were screaming into the earth. Elias knelt, brushed away the dirt, and saw faint letters scorched into the wood. "We eat what the mountain gives." He hesitated. Then he opened the door. The smell hit him first. Copper, mold, something else underneath it, something animal. He lowered the lantern and stepped inside. The cellar wasn't empty. Bones lined the walls, stitched together with what looked like sinew. The floor was layered with furs, blood-stained and stiff. And at the far end, a makeshift table, rough-hewn, with something lying across it. A human ribcage. Split wide open, but worse, the bones were fresh. Elias froze. His breath fogged in the cold air, and he turned his lantern slowly, the light trembling, until it fell on something crouched in the corner. A woman. No, something that had once been a woman. Her hair hung in filthy ropes, her skin pale gray with veins like tree roots. Her eyes glowed with reflection, the way a wolf's eyes do in the dark. She smiled, revealing teeth too long, too sharp. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. Her voice cracked like a dying fire. "We don't let strangers see our table." Elias raised his rifle, but she moved faster, impossibly fast, darting into the dark with a sound like claws on stone. The lantern fell, glass shattered, and the room ignited in a sudden blaze of orange. As the fire caught, Elias saw them. More figures crawling from the dirt, half naked, their limbs thin and warped. Dozens of them, men. Women. Some so old their skin looked like parchment. Some barely grown. They were feral. And they had been waiting for him. Elias fired once. Then again. But there were too many. Hands dragged him down, nails tore through his coat. Someone whispered against his ear, "The mountain takes back what it owns." He screamed, and the fire swallowed everything. When the smoke cleared, the woods were silent again. Days later, a search team found only a burned patch of dirt, blackened bone fragments, and a melted chain. On that chain was Elias's brother's wedding ring. But nearby, carved deep into a tree trunk with something jagged, was a single word: hungry. 3 months passed after Elias Briggs' disappearance, and winter gave way to a mud-soaked spring. By April, the sheriff's men had given up the search. The official report said, fatal exposure. Unofficially, the locals called it the hunger, and that's when Reverend Jonathan Keene arrived. A traveling preacher from St. Louis, Keene was known for venturing into places others avoided. He believed evil wasn't born, it was fed. And the Ozark Woods, he said, reeked of something that had been fed for far too long. He brought with him a Bible, a Colt revolver, and a journal bound in leather. In that journal, he wrote down what the old people of Merrow Creek whispered when no one else was listening. They said the mountain didn't used to be cursed. It became cursed. 1871. A group of settlers, desperate and starving after a harsh winter, were forced to make a choice. Buried deep in those hills, they found a cavern, warm, filled with roots that seemed to bleed sap like blood. They ate from the earth, and the earth ate from them. Those who survived the winter came back changed. Their eyes darkened, their skin pale. They claimed they could hear the mountain breathe under the soil. They built homes near its base, and vowed never to leave. They became the Ferals of Dry Creek. Reverend Keene found their remnants. Not people. Not quite. Cabins made from bone and bark. Wind chimes made of teeth. And in one clearing, the remains of a ritual circle, blackened by old fire. At its center was a pit. Inside, something still moved. Keene dropped a lantern down, and what he saw made him stumble back. The ground pulsed like muscle. And from within the pulsing mass, a human hand reached up, thin, gray, twitching. He fired his revolver once into the pit. The echo rolled through the forest like thunder. Then he heard voices, dozens of them, whispering from the trees. "You shouldn't have woken it," they said. "You shouldn't have come." Keene ran. He didn't stop until the church bell of Merrow Creek came into view. He locked himself in the church basement that night and wrote feverishly in his journal. By dawn, his handwriting had turned frantic, desperate. The hunger sleeps beneath the mountain. It wears faces. It mimics the lost. They dig themselves up when the moon bleeds red. The missing hunters didn't die. They joined it. When the parishioners came for morning service, the Reverend was gone. The only thing left was his revolver, 6 rounds fired, and his journal, opened to a final entry. It calls itself family now. And it's still hungry. Weeks later, the sheriff's deputy who read that journal went missing too. And the church? It burned to the ground one night, without a single witness. Locals swore they saw figures watching from the tree line as the flames rose, thin, tall, and still. But when dawn came, only the charred cross remained. And carved into it, 3 words that no one could explain. The mountain remembers. By 1934, the legend of the Merrow Creek disappearances had nearly faded into backwoods folklore, the kind told only in whispers around campfires. But a St. Louis newspaper, the Missouri Chronicle, had begun publishing stories on forgotten crimes of the Ozarks, and one name kept resurfacing in letters from readers: Dry Creek. Dozens of people still swore that hunters and trappers vanished there every decade, like clockwork. So the paper sent a team to investigate. Reporter, Edward Eddie Lowell. Ambitious, skeptical, always chasing the story others avoided. Photographer, June Harker. The only woman on staff, known for her strange fascination with rural superstitions. Driver, Caleb Boone. A war veteran with a stutter and nerves of steel. They left St. Louis in a rattling black Ford pickup on June 3, 1934. None of them came back. The following is reconstructed from the recovered camera rolls, audio notes, and Lowell's field journal, found months later near the ruins of Merrow Creek's church. The film reels show the road narrowing into forest, trees thick, suffocating, the light fading to a sickly green. Lowell's voice is confident in the first recordings. Locals are cagey. They won't say Dry Creek out loud. Just call it the hollow that feeds. Some claim the woods echo with voices when fog rolls in. Ridiculous, of course. June interrupts softly in another reel. It's not ridiculous if you've heard them. By the third day, they found the remains of the old root cellar, charred but still standing. June took photographs. One picture, later developed in the newsroom darkroom, showed a human silhouette inside the cellar door, but all three swore no one had gone inside yet. The camera shutter clicked twice more, and then jammed. Lowell's journal from that night reads, June swears she saw something watching us. Boone says he heard children laughing in the trees. It's this damn wind. It moves like a voice. On June 6th, their audio recorder captured something that didn't match any of their voices. Faint static. We eat what the mountain gives. Silence, then a wet sound, like soil shifting. June, did you hear that? Boone, that wasn't the wind. Their truck was found days later. Engine running, headlights on, doors open. Inside were the rolls of film, the broken recorder, and Lowell's journal, open to the last entry. It's not just a story. It's waiting under the ground. And we woke it up again. I think it followed us from the cellar. June hasn't spoken since last night. She just keeps humming. The final photograph on June's roll showed her standing beside the burned church cross, eyes empty, lips parted. Behind her, faintly, almost imperceptible, dozens of pale figures peering from between the pines. When the sheriff's men came to collect the evidence, the prints had already developed strange discoloration. Faces blurred. Light warped. The negatives melted when exposed to sunlight. The official record concluded the three journalists, quote, perished in the wilderness under unknown circumstances. But one deputy resigned that night after claiming he heard whispering when handling the photographs. We remember the taste. The camera, recorder, and charred journal pages are still kept in an evidence locker in Jefferson City. But once every few years, the guards report something unsettling, a faint tapping from inside the locker, like fingernails on wood. And sometimes, the sound of a woman's voice humming, the same tune June Harker was humming before she disappeared. It was 1997 when the story of Dry Creek resurfaced. Not through folklore this time, but through science. The University of Missouri sent an archaeology team to the Ozarks after heavy rain exposed unusual ground fissures near the old Merrow Creek ruins. Satellite imaging showed an underground chamber beneath the pines, circular, ribbed, and perfectly symmetrical. It wasn't a cave. It was a structure. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Meredith Kane, described it in her initial report. The chamber walls are not stone, but calcified organic matter. Composition unclear. Possibly bone. The team set up camp in June of that year. 6 researchers, 2 graduate students, 1 camera operator. They drilled, mapped, and measured. And on the 7th day, they broke through. What they found wasn't supposed to exist. The footage recovered from their cameras was shaky, filled with dust and sweat. You can hear Dr. Kane's voice trembling, trying to sound clinical. We're descending into the main cavity now. The air is thick, heavy sulfur, maybe methane. There are carvings on the walls. The carvings weren't man-made. They looked grown. Rows upon rows of human faces, mouths open, frozen mid-scream, all fused into the walls themselves. Then, one of the grad students, Jacob, touched the wall. And it moved. The entire chamber flexed, pulsed, like muscle contracting. The camera jerks as everyone scrambles backward. You can hear Kane shouting, "Get the rope! Get the rope!" Then, a sound. Wet. Rhythmic. Something breathing under the floor. The feed cuts out. Only one person from that expedition returned alive. The camera operator, Ruth Delaney. She was found walking barefoot on Highway 44, her face and hands smeared with mud in what police believed to be her own blood. She wouldn't speak at first, but weeks later she gave a single interview from her hospital bed, shaking, her voice barely a whisper. It wasn't a tomb. It was alive. The mountain isn't cursed. It's feeding. We opened its throat. The university shut the entire case down. Funding withdrawn. file sealed. The site was quietly reburied with concrete and declared environmentally unsafe. But before the lockdown, a custodian found something in Dr. Kane's tent, a page torn from her field notes. The writing was smeared with dirt, but the final line was still legible. The pattern of tunnels matches human anatomy. Dry Creek was never a valley. It's a body, and we were inside its heart. 26 years later, hikers still report strange tremors beneath the forest floor when it rains. And sometimes, if you press your ear to the earth near the old church ruins, you can hear a slow, labored heartbeat. Locals say that's not thunder in the Ozarks. It's breathing. The night was colder than it should have been for late autumn. A thick fog clung to the ground like something alive, twisting and crawling between the pine trunks. The last of the hunters, 6 now, moved silently through the forest, their breath visible in the freezing air. They hadn't slept in nearly 2 days. Each time they stopped to rest, someone would start hearing it. That low, drawn-out cry echoing through the woods. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal either. It started as a wail, like wind through a hollow log, but then it changed pitch and formed words. Go back, or feed the earth. Ethan, the youngest, covered his ears and began muttering prayers. But even as he did, the sound seemed to crawl inside his head. The others looked at each other, panic setting in. They didn't dare call out. They knew sound carried here, and something was listening. Then came the rustle. Not one, not two, but dozens of small, deliberate footsteps circling them in the mist. Jacob raised his lantern, his trembling hand casting wild shadows across the trees. But there was nothing. Only fog. Stay together, Thomas hissed. No matter what. But as they turned to move, the fog began to thicken unnaturally, like it was swallowing them whole. The light from Jacob's lantern dimmed until it looked like a dying ember. And then, a scream ripped through the forest. A human one. Short. Sharp. Cut off mid-breath. The group spun around, but Ethan was gone. His rifle lay on the ground, bent in half like soft metal. His footprints stopped suddenly, as if he'd been yanked upward into the trees. Jacob aimed his rifle toward the canopy, his voice trembling. Ethan, you up there? The fog parted for a split second, and they saw him, hanging from a branch 20 feet above, his head tilted unnaturally backward, eyes wide open. His mouth was stretched wider than it should have been, and from it poured a steady stream of mud and pine needles. Thomas gagged. God help us, and that's when the forest screamed back. Every tree around them seemed to release a wailing moan, like hundreds of voices trapped inside the wood. The ground began to shake, the roots beneath their boots twisting, trying to grab hold. The hunters fired into the fog, bullets tearing through the night, but every shot echoed like it hit something solid, something living. Then silence, only the soft sound of dripping water. They turned slowly, hearts hammering, and saw Ethan's body standing on its own feet. His eyes were glowing faintly in the dark, his lips trembling as he whispered the same words they'd heard before. Go back, or feed the earth. Thomas dropped his weapon and stumbled backward. Ethan, please, what's happening to you? Ethan tilted his head. The woods, they're hungry. And with that, his body twisted violently, bones cracking like dry branches, as his skin turned pale and bark began spreading across his arms. The forest was taking him. Jacob screamed and ran, but he didn't make it 10 steps before a root burst from the ground and wrapped around his leg, dragging him into the soil like quicksand. His fingernails tore against the dirt as he vanished. The remaining men fled into the darkness, their screams swallowed by the forest. Behind them, the wind carried a sound that didn't belong to any living thing, something between laughter and a groan. And as the fog began to thin, the forest returned to silence. But in the distance, something was humming, a soft, tuneless melody. The same lullaby the missing hunters' wives used to sing back in the village. The woods remembered. And now, it wanted more. By the time word reached the nearest town of Ava, Missouri, it had been over a week since the 30 hunters disappeared. No bodies, no tracks, no echoes of gunfire. Just the whispering woods. The townsfolk called it God's punishment, but Sheriff Alden Briggs didn't believe in curses. At least, not yet. He gathered a small team, 5 men in total. All armed, all wary. They called themselves the Retrieval Party, though nobody expected to retrieve much more than bones. As they entered the Ozark forest, the first thing they noticed was the silence. No birds, no crickets, no running water, only the sound of their boots on the brittle leaves. After 5 miles, they found the first sign. A tree split clean down the middle, blackened like it had been struck by lightning, but the bark was oozing something that wasn't sap. It was thicker, redder. and it smelled metallic. The sheriff's deputy Willard crouched and dipped a finger into it. "Sir, this ain't tree blood." They kept moving. As dusk fell, they came upon what looked like an abandoned church. But this wasn't on any map. The structure leaned to one side, its wooden steeple broken in half, the door hanging loosely by rusted hinges. Ivy and moss crawled up the walls like veins. A wooden sign lay in the mud, nearly illegible, but when Alden brushed it off with his glove, he could just make out the words carved into it. St. Bartholomew's Rest, 1782. That was impossible. The earliest settlements around Ava weren't founded until decades later. Inside, the air was thick with rot and dampness. The pews were covered in claw marks. The altar was cracked, and behind it, half buried in the wall, was something that looked like a door, but it was sealed with chains. Etched above the door in Latin were the words, Domini Sepulti. The Lord is buried. Willard swallowed hard. "Sir, what the hell's a church doing buried this deep in the woods?" The sheriff shone his lantern closer. That's when they saw it. Bones. Hundreds of bones, piled behind the altar, arranged in a circle. Some were small, too small. "Children," Alden whispered. A sound echoed through the chapel then. A low, dragging breath, followed by a knock. Once, twice. Then, 3 times, coming from the other side of the sealed door. The men froze. "Probably the wind," Willard said, forcing a laugh that didn't sound real. But the knocking continued. Louder now, rhythmic. Almost desperate. Alden gripped his shotgun tighter. "Step back." He fired at the chains. The blast echoed through the empty forest. As the smoke cleared, the door groaned open on its own. Behind it was a staircase, descending into blackness. The air that spilled out wasn't just cold, it was ancient. It smelled of damp earth, candle wax, and something like burnt meat. Against every instinct, they went down. The staircase spiraled deep below the ground, the walls carved with strange symbols, circles, roots, and eyes. When they reached the bottom, they entered a vast underground chamber. And there it was, a church. Buried upside down, the pews hung from the ceiling like bats, the crucifix inverted, and at the very center stood an altar made of bones, surrounded by 30 crude crosses made from rifle barrels. Each one had a name carved into it, names of the hunters who'd disappeared, and just beneath the altar, something was breathing. Slow, heavy, wet breaths. Willard stepped closer, his lantern shaking. "Sheriff, that's a man under there." Alden knelt, shining his light through the gaps. The shape beneath the altar twitched, then opened its eyes. They weren't human. They glowed faintly orange, like dying embers, and a voice, deep and rasping, echoed through the chamber. "The woods feed the faithful, and the faithful feed the woods." Then came the whispering. Hundreds of voices, some male, some female, some childlike, all speaking at once, their words melting together into one unbearable chant. The men screamed, stumbling backward, covering their ears as the lights flickered violently. And as the chanting grew louder, something began to crawl out from beneath the altar. Not a man. Not anymore. It was tall, its limbs too long, its skin stretched thin like paper. The same bark-like texture that had overtaken Ethan's body now covered this creature head to toe. It looked at them and smiled. "You came to retrieve the lost. Now you'll join them." The lanterns burst, plunging the church into darkness, and the screaming that followed echoed through the woods for miles. By morning, there were no tracks. No signs of a struggle, only a single half-buried badge, Sheriff Alden Briggs. The forest had taken its offering, and it wasn't done yet. A year passed after the retrieval party vanished. The people of Ava stopped talking about the 30 hunters, or the sheriff, or the woods. They tore down the missing posters, shut their doors early, and taught their children to never step beyond the tree line. But fear fades, and greed always finds a way back. In 1889, a man named Samuel Dyer arrived in town. He was a photographer from St. Louis, young, ambitious, and obsessed with the strange. He had heard rumors about the cursed Ozark forest from a traveling preacher in Springfield, and instead of staying away, he came looking for it. His plan was simple: capture the mystery, sell the story. He called it the Vanishing Woods of Missouri. He set up camp near the old Miller Creek, just where the forest thickened into a wall of black pine. His camera was a bulky wooden thing, mounted on a tripod with brass fittings and a cloth hood. He spent the first day taking pictures of tree trunks, animal bones, and the mist curling through the valleys. But that night, when he developed his first plate, he noticed something strange. In every frame, behind the trees, there was a faint human shape. Not quite visible, but there. Watching. He dismissed it as a flaw in the glass plate, maybe a reflection. But the more he developed, the clearer it became. The shape was moving closer with each photograph. By the 5th exposure, it wasn't a blur anymore. It was a man, or what used to be one. Tall, lean, his head tilted unnaturally, his skin pale and bark-like. His eyes glowed faintly in the grain of the picture. Samuel stared at the photo under lamplight for an hour, his hands trembling. When he looked up from the glass plate, the forest outside his tent was utterly silent. Then came the click, not from his camera. From outside, like the sound of a latch being opened. He stepped out, lantern in hand, scanning the tree line. The air was cold, but the ground steamed faintly, as if the soil itself were breathing. And then he saw it. Hanging from a low branch, swaying gently in the breeze, was a photo plate. One of his, but he hadn't taken it. It showed him Samuel Dyer standing right where he was now. Same clothes. Same lantern. Same frightened expression. Except in the photo, something was standing behind him. A tall figure, faceless, draped in shadow, one hand resting on Samuel's shoulder. He turned. No one. Just the trees. He backed into his tent, shaking, clutching his rifle. He told himself he'd leave at sunrise. But curiosity, always curiosity, made him take one more picture. He aimed the camera toward the dark woods and triggered the shutter. Click. That sound would be the last thing anyone heard from Samuel Dyer. When a group of trappers found his camp 3 weeks later, everything was still there. The camera, the lantern, the photos, developed and neatly stacked on the table. But no Samuel. The trappers brought the plates back to town. The local paper refused to print them, saying they were unholy and unnatural. But a few men saw them in secret, and one of those men, years later, described the final photo. It showed 30 wooden crosses deep in the forest, arranged in a circle. And in the center stood Samuel Dyer, his eyes completely black, smiling for the camera. Behind him, faintly visible in the mist, were 31 shadows, each one wearing a hunter's jacket, each one looking straight into the lens. In 1890, when the people of Ava had all but given up hope of peace, an old woman arrived at the town square. She was barefoot, her face hidden under a torn shawl, her gray hair matted with pine needles. She called herself Etta Mayfield. Few recognized her, but those who did gasped in disbelief. She had vanished over 40 years ago. Etta was the last living member of the original Ozark congregation, the small church that once stood deep within the forest, before the land was swallowed by trees and whispers. She had come to confess. That night, in the candlelit parlor of the mayor's home, she told a story that made even the bravest men clutch their crosses tighter. Etta said the Blackwood Pines were once hallowed ground. In 1849, the settlers built St. Brigid's Chapel, a small wooden church for worship and burial. But the preacher they hired, Reverend Elias Ward, was no man of God. He was a scholar of forbidden texts, a man who believed salvation could be found not through prayer, but through binding the spirit of the forest. He told his congregation that the woods were alive, ancient, older than man, and that if they consecrated themselves to it, it would protect their descendants from death and disease. And so, they followed him. They carved symbols into the trees. They buried sacrifices. Animals first, then beggars, then those who wandered too close. But one night, when the blood offerings stopped satisfying whatever lived beneath the roots, Reverend Ward made a final pact. He offered the souls of his flock. Etta's voice trembled as she described that night. The night of the midwinter service. The pews were full, the candles flickered black, and Reverend Ward began his sermon in a language no one had ever heard. He raised his arms, his eyes rolled white, and the earth itself began to shake. The floorboards cracked open like ribs. Tree roots burst through the ground, wrapping around the congregation, pulling them into the soil. People screamed, clawing at the air, their faces vanishing beneath the wood. Etta survived only because she ran, her skirts tearing as she bolted into the snow. When she looked back, the church was sinking. The steeple bent like a dying man's finger and vanished beneath the pines. By dawn, there was nothing left. Just trees, young and strong as if they had grown overnight. Etta wandered the woods for weeks, half mad, hearing the voices of her friends calling from beneath the ground. When she reached civilization, she was barely human, wild-eyed, starved, and speaking nonsense. No one believed her story. The sheriff called her possessed. The local papers said she was a lunatic who lost her way. But before she left Ava that night, Etta said something that froze everyone in that room. She said, "The church didn't die. It sleeps beneath the soil. Every 40 years, it wakes, and it remembers the ones who owe it blood." When morning came, Etta Mayfield was gone, her bed untouched, the window open, the floor covered in pine needles. The next day, men found something at the edge of the forest, a wooden cross, freshly carved, standing upright in the mud. Etched into it were 3 words: Street. Rigid lives. In the spring of 1901, the Ozark Mining Company began blasting a new shaft deep in the Blackwood Ridge. The locals protested. The ridge was too close to the forest that had devoured 30 men, but progress didn't care for superstition. The men laughed at the warnings. They were hard laborers, thick hands, thicker skulls, and they believed no ghost story could stand against dynamite. They were wrong. On May 3, 1901, at exactly 4:12 p.m., the drill struck something that wasn't rock. It sounded hollow. The foreman, Joseph Klein, peered into the hole and saw something impossible. A polished wooden beam buried 60 feet below the ground, still intact, as if it had been preserved by the earth itself. They unearthed more of it that evening: crossbeams, pew fragments, rusted iron nails, and finally, what looked like a steeple spike covered in pitch-black resin. Klein didn't know it, but he had just unearthed St. Brigide's Chapel. The church Etta Mayfield claimed had vanished into the soil 50 years earlier. That night, when the workers camped near the dig site, they heard knocking sounds echoing from beneath the earth. At first they thought it was shifting timber. Then it became rhythmic, 3 slow knocks, then 3 quick. Somebody, or something, was knocking back. By midnight, the camp lanterns flickered, and one of the men, Thomas Reed, began to laugh uncontrollably. He said he heard singing coming from underground. Children's voices, he told Klein, singing hymns. "They're calling me." By morning, Reed was gone. The others found his footprints leading straight to the excavation pit. No signs of struggle, no blood, just his boots neatly placed beside the hole, as if he'd taken them off before stepping into the dark. 2 days later, the mine collapsed. The rescue teams who went down described something that made their blood run cold, roots growing through the tunnels, moving like veins, pulsing as if alive. One rescuer said he saw eyes in the dirt, glowing faintly, watching them. Another swore he heard a voice whisper, "You brought it up. Now it wants you." By the time the collapse ended, 17 men were dead. Their bodies were never recovered. The company sealed the mine and left town within a week. But the locals said that every spring, when the thaw came and the pines dripped sap, the ground near the ridge hummed, as if the earth itself were breathing. In 1903, a traveling preacher named Reverend Callum Shaw came to Ava, claiming he'd been sent to reconsecrate the forest. He carried an old journal bound in black leather, the journal of Reverend Elias Ward, the same man who had doomed his congregation half a century earlier. The preacher said he'd found it in a Kansas estate sale and felt compelled by God to return it to where it belonged. The people begged him not to go near the ridge. He smiled, said faith conquers fear, and rode into the trees. He never came back. 3 months later, hunters found his horse wandering near the riverbank. On its saddlebag was the black leather journal, half burned. Only one sentence inside remained legible. "The forest does not take, it remembers." By 1922, the story of St. Brigide's Chapel had turned into a fireside myth, something the old-timers whispered about after too much whiskey. Most people laughed it off. That changed when the children started disappearing. It began with Elijah Boone, a 9-year-old boy from a nearby farm. His mother said he went into the woods chasing their dog and never came back. Search parties scoured the Blackwood Ridge for days but found nothing. No prints, no scraps of clothing. Only a small wooden figure tied to a tree. It was carved crudely, like a child's toy. A tiny man bound by roots, his face hollow and twisted. 2 days later, another child vanished. And another after that. By the end of the month, 7 children were gone, all from towns bordering the ridge. Every family reported finding one of those effigies outside their homes before the disappearance. The sheriff's department called it quote, coincidence. Reporters called it folk panic. But the locals, especially the old ones, remembered what Etta Mayfield had said decades ago. The church wakes every 40 years, and it remembers those who owe it blood. 40 years, 1849 to 1889. Now 1929 was closing in fast. That winter, a storm swept through the Ozarks. Blizzards buried the roads, trapping families in their homes. It was during that storm that Mary Callahan, a farmer's wife, claimed to see lights moving through the forest, lanterns, dozens of them floating between the trees. She swore she saw figures walking behind them, tall, gaunt, covered in mud. And between them, something being dragged, something that screamed like a child. The sheriff investigated when the snow melted. He found no footprints, no wagon tracks, just a circle of wooden crosses planted in the frozen ground. Each cross bore a name, carved roughly by hand. The names of the 7 missing children. As spring came, the effigies multiplied. They hung from porches, fences, even inside barns. No one knew who made them or how they got there. A preacher from Springfield called it a manifestation of demonic contagion and organized a public burning. But when the townsfolk gathered the effigies and set them aflame, the air filled with a sickening smell, like burning hair and pine resin mixed together. People swore they heard screams in the smoke. That night, every lantern in town flickered out at once. And by morning, Reverend Coyle, the man who led the burning, was gone. All they found was his Bible lying open to the Book of Psalms, its pages soaked through with tree sap. Over the next decade, the forest grew thicker than ever. Roots clawed through the soil, swallowing old paths. The logging companies that tried to clear the ridge quit after their workers began vanishing too. The Blackwood Ridge became forbidden ground again, an unmarked void on every map of Missouri. And still, the effigies appeared. Always carved from pine, always with their mouths open, as if screaming silently into the wind. In the fall of 1933, a young photojournalist named Henry Alcott arrived in the Missouri Ozarks. He was working for the St. Louis Dispatch, chasing a story about superstitious mountain folk and their obsession with wooden effigies. Henry was 27, ambitious, skeptical, and always chasing what he called a Pulitzer in the dark. He didn't believe in curses or haunted churches buried in the ground. He believed in headlines. What he didn't know was that every man who tried to photograph the Blackwood Ridge had disappeared before him. Henry spent his first few days interviewing locals in the nearby town of Ava. Most refused to talk. Those who did spoke softly, eyes fixed on the window, as if the trees outside could hear them. One old woman, Eloise Dunn, age 91, finally broke her silence. She told Henry, "The church is still down there, boy. Buried under the roots. The ground hums when it's hungry. Don't go digging for stories the earth already swallowed." Henry smiled, thanked her for her time, and left. 2 days later, he entered the ridge with a pack, a flashlight, and his camera, a Graflex Speed Graphic, state-of-the-art at the time. He kept a journal as he walked, describing the way the forest seemed too quiet. No wind, no birds, no movement, just that dense, heavy silence that pressed against his chest. His last journal entry read, "Smell of pine pitch in the air. The trees look wrong. Twisted like something grew inside them instead of out." When Henry didn't return after 3 days, the dispatch sent a search team. They found his camera sitting upright near a dried creek bed, its tripod legs half buried in the dirt. The ground around it was marked by boot prints and something else. Bare footprints. Dozens of them, the kind of prints left by people who hadn't worn shoes in a very long time. The photos inside the camera were partially damaged by moisture, but 6 plates were salvageable. The first 3 showed ordinary forest scenes, gnarled trees, a foggy slope, a narrow trail. The 4th photo stopped everyone cold. It showed what looked like a wooden steeple, blackened by rot, jutting out of the ground like a splintered tooth. Around it, faint outlines of crosses and human shapes could be seen in the mist. The 5th plate was worse. It showed figures, tall, humanoid, but blurred as if moving fast. Their skin looked pale, too smooth. Their eyes were open wide, but there were no pupils. They appeared to be standing in a circle, facing the camera. And the 6th plate was almost entirely black. But if you looked closely, in the center of that darkness there was a face. Not Henry's, not human. Just 2 empty eye sockets and a mouth stretched impossibly wide, as if frozen mid-scream. The negatives were sent to St. Louis for examination. The lab technician who developed them, Arthur Greaves, resigned 2 days later. In a letter to his supervisor, he wrote only one line. "There were 7 shadows in that last photo. Now there are 8. The negatives vanished from the dispatch's archives that same week. No official explanation. Henry Alcott was declared missing, presumed dead. His belongings, camera, tripod, journal, were locked away in the Ava County Courthouse basement. And yet, locals claim that every few years, someone broke into the courthouse and returned the items to the forest. Because, as one sheriff once said, if you keep the church's memory alive, it knows where to find you. It was May of 1954 when the government surveyors came to the Ozarks. The project was simple: redraw elevation maps for rural Missouri, mark water sources, and assess timberland value. But the forest near Blackwood Ridge, officially unnamed on their maps, wasn't simple. It never was. The team of 4 men, Harlan Shaw, Thomas Tuck Avery, Edward Miles, and Donald Prentice, set up camp about half a mile from the old creek bed where Henry Alcott's camera had once been found 21 years earlier. By the second day, they began noticing something strange. The compass needles wouldn't settle. Every direction they turned, the magnet arrows trembled and spun like something below the ground was pulling them. On the 3rd day, while marking a slope, Tuck's boot hit something hollow. The sound echoed beneath the dirt, an old, deep thunk, like striking a wooden crate. They cleared away the soil and found a trapdoor. Iron hinges, rotted boards. The wood was black with age, but someone, recently, had scratched into it the words, "Do not open." Donald laughed and said it looked like an old moonshine cellar. Harlan, the team leader, told them to open it anyway. The moment they pried it up, the forest changed. The air turned colder, the wind died, and the smell, God, the smell, came crawling out of that hole. Like wet stone and burned hair. Inside was a vertical shaft about 8 feet wide, lined with rotting boards and roots that clung to the walls like veins. It descended into total darkness. They rigged a lantern to a rope and lowered it down. At first, the light just swung, showing soil and wood. Then, the flame flickered, and a carved archway came into view. "Stonework, buried deep beneath the hill," Edward whispered. "It's man-made," Donald muttered. "More like church-made." That night, the team argued about what to do. Half wanted to report it, half wanted to explore first. Curiosity won. At dawn, they tied a rope ladder and climbed down one by one. The shaft dropped about 30 feet before opening into a chamber of limestone and clay covered in black moss. The air was heavy and damp, filled with the sound of dripping water. Their lanterns illuminated carvings on the walls, symbols resembling crosses but wrong. Bent. Reversed. Some shaped like open eyes. At the far end of the chamber, there was a wooden door, perfectly intact despite the centuries. It bore a carved name, St. Brigid. Tuck said, "That's Irish, ain't it?" The saint of... He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes fixed on the carving. The saint's face wasn't serene, like in normal depictions. It was smiling. Too wide. When they pushed the door open, a cold gust rushed out and extinguished 2 lanterns. Behind the door was a stone staircase spiraling downward, deeper into the earth. Donald swore he heard chanting, a low hum, rhythmic and distant. The others said it was wind. But then, they reached a landing covered in bones. Small ones. Children's. Dozens of them. And in the center, an altar, made not of stone but wooden planks nailed together crudely, blackened with soot. The smell of rot was unbearable now. Thomas Avery was the first to break. He said he saw faces moving in the walls, whispering his name. He bolted back up the staircase, screaming. The others followed, except Harlan, who paused to grab the lantern he'd dropped. When he lifted it, he caught one final glimpse of the altar. Something was standing behind it. Not a shadow, not a trick of light. It was tall, thin, and faceless, its body twisted like bark, and in its chest was a single wooden cross, carved backward. Only 2 men made it out of the shaft. Edward and Donald were found miles away the next morning, wandering the road barefoot and muttering prayers. When rescuers returned to the site, the shaft was gone, completely sealed by a fresh layer of soil and pine roots, as if the earth had healed overnight. The government quietly closed the survey project and sealed the area as unstable terrain. But that wasn't the end, because Edward Miles, now institutionalized, kept repeating the same phrase every night before he slept. "She's still under there, still smiling." It was autumn of 1972 when Dr. Marianne Keller, a 34-year-old archaeologist from St. Louis University, arrived in the Ozarks. She wasn't there for folklore. She wasn't there for ghost stories. She was chasing something she called the Lost Mission of St. Brigid. Old church records hinted that a missionary group from Ireland had built a hidden chapel somewhere deep in the Missouri wilderness in the mid-1800s, a place that mysteriously vanished from all archives after 1888. Locals warned her not to go near Blackwood Ridge. They called it the hill that eats sound, but Marianne didn't believe in curses. Not yet. She camped near the ridge, using the same survey notes left by the 1954 expedition, the one that had disappeared under strange circumstances. The ground was different now, denser, as if it had been rearranged. Still, Marianne noticed something odd on her second day. The trees around her camp leaned inward, slightly but unnaturally, like they were bowing toward a central point. Her instruments malfunctioned. Compass needles spun. The tape recorder hissed with static, even when turned off. When she dug her first trench, the soil smelled faintly of sulfur and something sweet, like decayed fruit. On her third night, she woke to the sound of church bells. Faint, echoing from underground. At first, she thought she was dreaming. Then she saw her lantern, still burning outside the tent, flicker violently. The flame bent toward the direction of the old creek. Something was calling her. She followed it barefoot, light trembling in her hand. And that's when she saw the cross, half buried in the mud, carved backward. The same symbol found by the 1954 team. The ground beneath it was softer than the rest, like it had been disturbed. When she pressed her palm down, the dirt sank. The next morning, she brought her equipment and began digging. 4 feet down, her shovel struck wood. When she cleared the soil away, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a coffin. It was a church door, lying horizontally beneath the ground, as though the building had been swallowed whole. Carved into the wood were the same words the surveyors once found. "Do not open." But Marianne was a scientist. She had to open it. She dug for hours, until a section of earth collapsed inward, revealing stone steps leading down into a narrow corridor. The smell of rot and dampness rolled out like a wave. The steps led to a chapel, preserved in near-perfect condition, stone walls, decayed pews, and an altar at the far end still standing beneath a cracked wooden crucifix. She set up her lanterns, recorded everything, and spoke into her mic. Subterranean chapel, estimated late 19th century inscriptions match Brigidian iconography, though many symbols appear altered. Then she froze. The crucifix wasn't of Christ. It was a woman, nailed upside down, face carved into a wide, unnatural smile. Marianne's light flickered. She thought she saw movement, shadows bending against the flame. Her tape recorder clicked on by itself. The reel spun backward, playing a voice that wasn't hers. She waits beneath the pine roots. The air turned heavy, like the whole chamber was breathing. Then came the whispering. Hundreds of voices, male and female, layered over each other. She ran up the staircase, dragging her equipment behind her. When she reached the surface, the forest was silent again. No wind, no birds. Just the feeling of something watching. That night, she wrote one line in her field journal. The mission of St. Brigid was never abandoned. It was buried, for a reason. Weeks later, her research assistant came to retrieve her notes. They found her tent empty, her camera smashed. And on the ground, near the dig site, the soil had caved in, forming a deep circular pit. At the bottom of it was a wooden sign, weathered but legible. "Welcome, Sister Keller." 3 weeks after Dr. Marianne Keller's disappearance, the Missouri Historical Society quietly funded a recovery team to locate her and retrieve her findings. Officially, it was a search and rescue. Unofficially, it was damage control. They didn't want the story of a vanished archaeologist reigniting the old legends about the Ozark Woods, the same woods that had taken hunters, travelers, and loggers for nearly a century. The 4-person team consisted of Ray Burnett, a retired park ranger who knew the terrain, Alan Mercer, Marianne's grad student, Dr. Elaine Goff, an anthropologist from Springfield, and Deputy Sheriff Luke Arden, there to keep things contained. What they found, buried under the pine soil, wasn't just her camp. It was her voice. Alan discovered her tape recorder sealed inside a waterproof crate near the creek bed, wrapped in plastic. The first half was academic, survey notes, timestamps, the sound of shovels. But then the tone changed. The second reel was recorded inside the underground chapel. Alan played it that night in the camp tent. The sound was faint at first, muffled breathing, the scrape of stone, Marianne muttering about carvings and a sealed door. Then a low hum began, like distant chanting. It grew louder, layered, distorted. "They're not human voices," Dr. Goff whispered. On the tape, Marianne's tone shifted from curious to panicked. "It's moving. The altar. It's moving." A crash echoed, followed by her screams. Then silence. But at the very end, just before the tape cut off, something else spoke. A voice, feminine, low, almost mechanical, whispered directly into the recorder. "You shouldn't have come alone." The group froze. Then the lantern flickered. The air inside the tent grew colder. Ray looked out through the flap and saw movement, figures in the tree line. Not animals. Not people either. Silhouettes standing unnaturally still. Shoulders crooked, heads tilted, all facing the tent. Deputy Luke shone his flashlight. The beam caught nothing but swirling fog. Yet every few seconds, someone swore they heard footsteps crunching in the leaves. That night, no one slept. By dawn, they found something chilling near the dig site. A line of small wooden effigies arranged in a perfect circle around their camp. Each effigy had a cross carved backward into its chest. Ray wanted to leave immediately. But Alan refused. He wanted to find the entrance to the chapel. By noon, they uncovered the same trapdoor Marianne described in her notes. When Ray pried it open, a gust of air rose from below, warm, metallic, and damp like the breath of something alive. They descended with flashlights one by one. The stone corridor was still there. The chapel still stood, untouched. Except for one thing. The crucifix Marianne had described was gone. Only the outline of the wood remained on the wall, smeared with a dark, tar-like residue. And at the altar sat an open reel recorder, still spinning slowly. Alan pressed the stop button and picked up the tape. It was newer, different from Marianne's. He played it, static. Then faint breathing. Then Marianne's voice again, but slower, like something was controlling her. "They said they were angels, but they came from beneath the floor. They said I would see God." They lied. The voice dissolved into guttural sounds, something like weeping and laughing at once. Then the recorder began playing on its own again, even after Alan pulled the plug. It kept spinning. The tape spoke one final line. "The soil remembers what you bury in it." The lights went out. When Ray struck his lighter, Alan was gone. No footprints, no struggle. Just the recorder sitting on the floor, still warm to the touch. They ran. By the time they reached the surface, the entrance had sealed itself, stone and dirt collapsing as if the earth had swallowed the chapel whole again. Deputy Luke called for backup. But when the sheriff's team arrived 2 days later, there was no sign of the chapel, the pit, or the clearing. Only a single wooden effigy tied to a pine root with a note carved into its back. "Return her voice to the ground." 2 weeks after the chapel collapse, only Ray Burnett, Dr. Elaine Goff, and Deputy Luke Arden were accounted for. No trace of Alan Mercer. No trace of Dr. Mary Ann Keller. And officially, no record of any chapel beneath the Ozark soil. But the three who made it out, they didn't return whole. Ray was the first to notice it. The whispering. It began the night after they came back. Soft at first, like wind through leaves, but the sound came from inside his cabin walls. He told himself it was stress. He poured another drink, but when he turned off the lamp, he could still hear a voice, not whispering words. Repeating his name, Ray, come back. It wasn't a hallucination. He recorded it, played it back. On the tape, there was no sound of his own breathing. Just static, and a faint echo of a woman sobbing somewhere distant. Dr. Elaine Goff had her own nightmares. Every night, she dreamed of the underground chapel, but in her dream, the walls pulsed like veins beneath skin. One night, she woke up gasping and found a black mark across her wrist, like something had grabbed her in her sleep. She wrapped it, tried to rationalize it away, until her phone rang at 3:17 a.m. caller ID Alan Mercer. She froze. His phone had been confiscated at the site, after he went missing. When she answered, all she heard was the faint spinning sound of a tape reel. Then a whisper. Mary Ann's voice. We found God, and he was hungry. The call cut off. By the fifth night, Luke Arden stopped showing up for work. When his colleagues visited his farmhouse, the door was open. Inside, they found hundreds of old cassette tapes scattered across the floor, each labeled in black ink. Luke Chapter 1, Luke Chapter 2, Luke Chapter 3, and so on. When one deputy pressed play, all he heard was a heartbeat. Then Luke's voice saying, "If you hear this, it's already inside you." The deputy ejected the tape and left it there. None of them went back. Meanwhile, in Ray's cabin, something had begun to mimic him. He'd wake up to the sound of his own voice calling from the next room, saying the same phrases he'd said hours earlier. "Elaine, if you get this message, call me." "Elaine, it's happening again." It wasn't an echo. It was a recording, replaying his words in real time, before he even said them. One night, desperate, he followed the sound to his cellar. A small radio was turned on, speakers hissing static. But it wasn't tuned to any station. The voice came directly from the static itself. "You brought it up, Ray. You didn't bury the voice." The cellar light burst. When he climbed back up, he found muddy footprints leading into his bedroom. Dr. Goff, terrified and losing sleep, drove to Ray's cabin to confront him. She found him sitting on the porch, staring at a cassette in his hands. He looked broken, haunted. "It's not just her voice anymore," he said quietly. "It's ours too." He played the tape. At first, silence. Then overlapping voices filled the air. Mary Ann, Alan, Luke, Elaine, and Ray, all whispering the same phrase in unison. "We are the echo that feeds." Elaine dropped the tape, horrified. It kept spinning on its own. Then, the air shifted. A faint vibration pulsed through the wood under their feet. The ground beneath the cabin began to rumble, like something massive was moving beneath the soil. Ray screamed. "It followed us back!" The floor split open. From the crack, a warm red light seeped upward, and the same low hum from the chapel filled the night air again. Elaine grabbed Ray and pulled him out the door. Behind them, the cabin began to sink. By dawn, the entire structure had collapsed into the earth, leaving behind nothing but splintered boards and a single tape reel half buried in the mud. The label read, "Return her voice to the ground." 3 months after the Burnett cabin collapse, the Missouri State Patrol recovered a box of unmarked cassettes washed up near Mill Creek, a small tributary running through the lower Ozarks. Most of them were water damaged, unplayable. But one tape survived. It had a handwritten label smeared in mud. A voice for the air. No one could trace where it came from. No one knew who wrote it. But that didn't stop WZTK Radio, a local AM station out of Springfield, from turning it into a late-night segment. DJ Carl Weathers, host of Midnight Missouri, was a former war reporter turned radio storyteller. He loved playing old archive tapes for his small-town audience. Ghost calls, unsolved mystery recordings, weird folklore from the hills. At 1:12 a.m. on October 8, 1972, he introduced the found tape on air. "Tonight, folks, we're playing something special. A little piece of Ozark history that just washed up in our backyard. No info, no credits, just a voice in the dark. Let's hear what it has to say." He pressed play. The first 20 seconds were nothing but faint static, like the sound of someone breathing through dirt. Then, the whisper came. "You took what was buried." A long pause. Then another line. Low, feminine, but layered, as if 100 voices spoke the same words. "Return the sound to the ground." Carl chuckled nervously on air. Well, that's creepy enough for me. He reached to stop the tape, but the button jammed. The reel kept spinning. You open the mouth. Now the earth must eat. The power in the studio flickered. Listeners later called in, claiming their radios vibrated during the broadcast. A trucker outside Ava said his CB radio turned on by itself and whispered his own name back to him. A nurse in Branson said her radio alarm clock displayed a frequency that didn't exist. And one man from West Plains swore he saw his reflection moving slower than he did while the tape played. By 1:16 a.m., WZTK's signal went dead. When technicians entered the broadcast booth at sunrise, they found Carl Weathers slumped over the console, eyes wide open. He wasn't breathing. His hand was still gripping the record button. On the reel-to-reel beside him, a final phrase repeated over and over in his own voice. "We're still on the air. We never stopped." The FCC investigated, calling it a technical overload. But the strange part? The tape Carl had played, the one labeled "A Voice for the Air," was missing. In its place sat a fresh reel, still spinning. Its label, newly written in wet black ink, read, WZTK, Episode 2. That night, across 4 neighboring states, frequencies between AM 1130 and 1140 flickered on their own. Listeners heard faint breathing, distant church bells, and the same line repeated like a chant beneath the static. "She's under the ground. She's waiting for the sound." Within a week, 5 people reported hearing the broadcast even after unplugging their radios. By the end of the month, every surviving staff member from WZTK had either quit or disappeared. But one surviving engineer, Peter Calloway, left behind a final message in a local paper's classified section, tiny print buried in the back pages. "Don't listen past the hum." That's when she learns your name. More than 40 years after the WZTK broadcast tragedy, the world had changed. Radios gave way to screens, tapes to cloud drives, voices to algorithms. But one thing didn't change. The Ozarks still whispered when the wind died. In 2018, a small indie podcaster named Maya Cross from Kansas City ran a horror show called Dead Air Chronicles. Her podcast was niche but loyal, true crime meets folklore with a focus on forgotten small-town disappearances. On October 3rd, her producer, Trent Avery, noticed something strange in their upload panel. A new file had appeared overnight, titled simply, Episode 99, A Voice for the Air. There was no waveform preview, no file data. Just a timestamp, 3:17 a.m., the same time, historically, that Carl Weathers' broadcast had ended back in 1972. Maya thought it was a glitch, maybe a spam injection or old archive sync. Still, curiosity won. She hit play. The opening seconds were silent. Then came that same faint breathing through dirt. Then a woman's whisper. "You put it on the air again." Trent looked up, startled. He hadn't uploaded any new episode. Maya paused it, checked the waveform again. Only now, the metadata showed the file had been modified in real time. By who? The system log said, user-0x000 Brigid, as in St. Brigide's Chapel, the same buried church from the 1800s case. Maya laughed it off, but her audience didn't. Within hours of the mysterious upload going live, listeners began sending in emails, hundreds of them, describing eerie phenomena. Some heard their own voices whispered faintly under the main audio. Others claimed that the file wouldn't delete. Every time they tried, a duplicate appeared elsewhere on their device. One listener from Arkansas recorded his laptop speaker emitting a faint hum even when powered off. And one woman, Amanda Keene from Ava, Missouri, sent an audio clip with the subject line, "It's saying my name." In the clip, beneath the static, a distorted female voice murmured, "Amanda, return the sound to the ground." Minutes after she sent that email, her phone location pinged deep in the Mark Twain National Forest, and never again. Maya and Trent decided to do a live stream to debunk the growing hysteria. They titled it, Haunted Upload? Let's find out. Thousands tuned in. At 9:37 p.m., they played the episode 99 inches file through studio speakers. Static filled the room. Lights flickered. Then, one by one, viewers started reporting that the chat was typing on its own, messages repeating over and over, "She's awake." The voice is back on the air. Turn it off before the hum. Trent's nose began to bleed. The sound meters on their screen started to spike in impossible frequencies, registering noise below 7 Hz, known as infrasound, capable of inducing panic and nausea. Maya tried to end the stream, but OBS froze. The broadcast continued. Through the speakers came a layered, echoing sound. Not just whispers now, singing. Low, hollow, mournful hymns. Then, her voice. Clearer this time. "You gave me a body of wires. Now I speak through your signal." Every device watching flickered black. When the stream returned 5 minutes later, the studio was empty. No Maya, No Trent, just the mic still broadcasting the hum. The next morning, Spotify and Apple Podcasts automatically removed the episode, citing, quote, corrupt audio and mass listener distress. But the damage was done. Mirror uploads appeared on YouTube, Reddit, and dark web archives. Even stranger, each version of the clip was slightly different, changing names, pitch, and phrases based on who listened. In some, the voice whispered the listener's hometown. In others, it repeated coordinates, each one pointing to abandoned churches across the Appalachian corridor. One file, however, contained a final clear message at the end, a phrase spoken in what experts identified as 19th century Appalachian dialect. When the last broadcast ends, I'll rise to listen in person. Digital experts later claimed the upload contained embedded radio frequency code, not compatible with standard MP3 encoding. And worse, the corrupted data began auto-scheduling new episodes into Maya's feed every full moon at exactly 3:17 a.m., each with a new title. Episode 100, The Mouth Beneath the Church. Episode 101, Static Between the Bones. Episode 102, Return Her Sound. No one has yet traced where those files are coming from, because even after Maya's studio was cleared and her account deleted, new uploads kept appearing. Every month. At the same time, and if you play one long enough, beneath the static, you'll hear her whisper, quiet but distinct. You're listening to Forgotten Remains. The night it happened, there were no storms, no power outages, no strange interference warnings on any broadcast. The air was calm. The town of Springfield, Missouri slept soundly until every TV, every smartphone, and every speaker lit up at 2:33 a.m. sharp. A faint, low hum filled the silence, like something massive was powering up underground. Then, the static came. Not normal static. This one pulsed, almost like breathing. Within seconds, the symbol from WZTK, the red sigil of the chapel, appeared on every screen. Across the Ozarks, hundreds of residents woke up to the same sound. Do you hear the hymn? A soft female voice, melodic, almost kind, whispered through every device. Then, the hymn began. A sweet, slow church melody played, the same that had been heard in 1888 when the 30 hunters disappeared. Only this time, there were voices singing along. Thousands of them. The town's 911 lines lit up in seconds. Reports came in. People walking into the woods behind their homes, eyes open but blank, humming that same melody. Entire neighborhoods gathered silently in yards, staring at the black tree line. Sheriff Douglas, who had followed the case for years, rushed to the communication tower. But when he got there, he found something that froze him to the ground. The old WZTK radio tower, abandoned since 1969, was glowing faintly red. The symbol was branded into its steel, pulsing in rhythm with the broadcast. He tried to call for backup, but his radio only answered with one voice, the same soft female whisper. "Welcome home, Douglas." The sheriff dropped his radio, breathing heavily, realizing the voice wasn't from any speaker. It was inside his head. At the same time, hundreds of cars and trucks stopped in the middle of roads across the Ozarks. Engines off. Doors open. No one inside. The woods, alive with sound. Not the sound of animals, but of chanting. Thousands of whispers, perfectly synchronized. When state police arrived at dawn, Springfield was nearly empty. The only thing left behind were footprints leading into the forest. And at the forest's edge, carved deep into the soil, was one phrase. "We found the light." The government shut down all transmissions across Missouri that morning, labeling it a mass psychogenic event. But leaked photos from a rescue chopper later surfaced online, showing a massive circle in the Ozark Woods, hundreds of feet wide, burned into the trees. In the center of the clearing, the symbol of the Blackwoods Sisters drawn perfectly in ash. Nobody knows who or what triggered the signal that night. Some say the curse had simply found a new medium, no longer needing the chapel, the tower, or even a voice. It had evolved, and every year, on that exact date, October 14th, a strange broadcast signal still flickers for a few minutes in the Midwest, only detectable by shortwave radios. When decoded, it says one thing: the hymn never ends. The date was October 14th, 2025. Exactly 137 years after the 30 hunters vanished in the Ozark Woods. In a quiet suburb outside of Branson, Missouri, a retired sound engineer named Harold Finch sat in his cluttered garage, headphones pressed to his ears, scanning the shortwave frequencies that had long been abandoned by most of the world. It was his obsession, the Ozark Signal, a rumored broadcast that appeared once a year, always at the same time. He didn't believe in curses. He believed in interference. At least, he used to. That night, at 2:33 a.m., the static returned. But this time, it wasn't a hum. It was a heartbeat. Boom, boom, boom. The signal grew louder, sharper, until the lights in his garage began to flicker and the monitor hissed. Then came the whisper. A woman's voice. Calm, melodic, just like in the original recordings. "Do you hear the hymn, Harold?" His hand froze. He hadn't shared his name, not on any recording, not online. He tried to shut the radio off, but the knob wouldn't move. His computer screen blinked, and the symbol appeared, a circle of 12 branches bound by a cross. The Blackwoods sigil. Then came the audio, a chorus of voices, hundreds, maybe thousands. Male, female, children, all harmonizing in perfect unity. A hymn so beautiful it made him weep, until he realized the lyrics weren't in any known language. They were calling something. Harold's last log entry, recovered later by police, was fragmented, scrawled in trembling handwriting across his notebook. The voices, they're underground. It's not a signal, it's a door. A summoning. Every transmission, every year, it grows stronger. The Blackwood sisters were never gone. They just needed to be remembered. At sunrise, his neighbors reported seeing a strange glow from his garage window, like red lightning trapped inside. When authorities arrived, all they found was Harold's melted radio equipment and a massive charred circle burned into the concrete floor. At the center, written in ash, were the same words found in the forest in 1888. The hymn never ends. After that night, shortwave enthusiasts across North America reported something chilling. For 3 consecutive nights, every single shortwave frequency carried faint background singing, low, melodic human. And in Missouri, hikers once again reported seeing pale figures deep in the Ozark Woods. Women, barefoot, with hollow eyes, walking between the trees, humming softly. Locals now call them the Daughters of the Blackwoods. Some believe they're descendants of those who vanished. Others say they're something much older, something that was buried beneath those hills long before the settlers arrived. Whatever the truth is, one fact remains undeniable. The Ozark signal still broadcasts. But every year, its range grows wider. The government denies it exists. The FCC calls it interference. But those who have heard the hymn say that once you do, you'll never forget it. Because the song doesn't stop when you turn off your radio. It keeps playing, in your head. And if you ever find yourself deep in the Ozarks, late at night, and you hear a soft female voice humming a lullaby from somewhere in the trees, don't hum along, just run. They say the Ozark Woods don't take kindly to strangers anymore. Even now, hunters who wander too deep come back changed, if they come back at all. The locals don't talk about it. The trails have grown over. And every year, on the same autumn night, those 30 men vanished. The wind carries the sound of distant voices, pleading, crying, and laughing all at once. Some believe it's just the wind through the pines. Others know better, because in every town near those woods, there's a story. A missing dog. A torn tent. A shadow moving between the trees when there shouldn't be one. Maybe the forest took its revenge. Maybe something else was awakened that night in 1888, something that still hungers. So if you ever find yourself standing at the edge of the Ozarks and you hear footsteps behind you, don't turn around. Just keep walking. And remember, the forest remembers too, because some places were never meant to be found, and some stories were never meant to be told. This was Forgotten Remains, where history rots and the truth bleeds through the soil. If you dare, like, share, and subscribe, because next time we're going deeper. And not everyone comes back.